Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, or wherever you're calling us from, or joining in from today. My name is Jason Buffington. Actually, I guess it's that same name every day. But this week, we're visiting with Veeam's CTO, Danny Allen. Danny, thanks for joining the program.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. I've been watching almost every week for the past few months, and it's exciting to be part of the show today.
Awesome. Well, then, as you know, we start the program with, we want to find out where folks are joining from. So we'll bring the map up in just a minute, but please feel free to, in the LinkedIn stream, give us a comment. Tell us where you're from. Tell us what you had for your last meal, whatever's going on. So let's see. So I'm representing the great state of Texas. I see that George is already in the house. I'm trusting that New Hampshire is there because Danny's there, but that dot's so small. Can't hardly tell. Romania's in the house. India, you can always count on being on time. Thank you for that. Got a few other green splotches, but we want to make this whole world green in more ways than one. So please feel free to chime in on that. But it is the top of the hour, so let's go ahead and start up. And so, Danny, since you have been watching the program, you know that for as much of the first 20 minutes of the program as possible, we really want to try to take off our Veeam hats. You can just cover the left side of your shirt for just a second. And we really just want to talk about what really is going on in the IT industry that, perhaps has ramifications for data protection. So, when you talk to CTOs, when you talk to CIOs and VPs of IT, we are not in a state of dormancy right now. There's a lot of things moving. What are the things that you're hearing at the top line for challenges or considerations? What are people talking about at your level?
Sure. Well, there are essentially three things that I hear more frequently, probably than anything else. Unsurprisingly, the top thing is COVID-19. I would say almost every conversation begins with COVID and what the impact is of the pandemic on the organization. And I expect that to continue to be the case for the next 6 months. I'd say the second thing that I hear most frequently is cost. Obviously, because of the pandemic and the impact on all of these businesses, every CIO, every VP of infrastructure, everyone who's running a data center is saying, how can I drive my costs down? And then lastly, it pivots to the opportunity, tends to be around cloud. So I know these aren't the typical 3 C's, but I hear COVID, cost, and cloud are probably the most frequent top line message items. So one of the interesting things about COVID and COVID-19 clearly is that everyone is figuring out how to work from home and remote operations. One of the interesting things that is happening right now clearly is that people are enabling an entirely remote workforce, both internally, but also with their partners. And so we're on Teams all day, we're on Zoom all day, we're figuring out how to send out laptops. And that is, I would argue, both good and represents an opportunity. One of the interesting things we're seeing, of course, in the large technology companies are that they're enabling a remote workforce in the long term. And this is good. We're doing this podcast, of course, it's live, and I guess Jason actually dropped off, but we're enabling this type of remote collaboration. So that is exciting, and every CIO is grappling with how do we manage the operations with COVID-19. The second thing about cost is really interesting. They're all trying to minimize, obviously, the burden of cost to the organization and what they're paying. And there's really kind of 3 things that I'm hearing from the VPs of infrastructure and people running the data centers. And it's not what you would expect. There was actually a Gartner paper last week, it was interesting, that said by 2025, 80% of enterprise data centers would be shut down. And that's clearly not happening. There's been a lot of deferral in projects, but what is happening around cost management is things like rack optimization. Everyone says, hey, I'm 90% virtualized, but they might not have optimized their data center. And so you talk to VPs of infrastructure who say, how can I put more servers in my data center? Second thing that you hear is a lot about being virtually optimized. Yes, they might be 90% virtualized, but that doesn't mean necessarily that they're optimized for virtualization. So they're looking at the infrastructure and saying, hey, how can I manage the costs and drive more execution out of the servers that I have. And then lastly, unsurprisingly, probably to you, Jason, is the whole cloud conversation. The cost rolls right into cloud, and they're saying, how do I leverage cloud more effectively to deliver the services that I need to?
So let's talk about the first two. When you mentioned about the data center going away, man, that's really tough for me to comprehend that concept, especially when you talk about your number 2 point of virtualization. I certainly still think we see a lot of organizations that are in their first or second generation of virtualized infrastructure architecture, right? So they're still running on a bunch of pizza boxes in a lot of those racks. So for many of them, the idea of modernizing virtualization, the workload might already be virtualized, but it's running on archaic and less flexible metal. And so I still think that we're not through seeing the modern data center embrace hyperconverged as an architecture. I think I have to believe we're going to see that before we see the data center turn off. What are your thoughts?
I would agree with that. The data center is not going away. That statistic from Gartner, it was called the death of the data center, that said 80% of enterprise data centers would be shut down by 2025. I frankly don't believe that. Why don't I believe that? Because I have a saying, I didn't originate it. I heard it from someone else that says the cloud is not a charity. And the cloud is not a charity. They layer in margin to everything that they run. However, to your point, I think we're going from generation 1 to generation 2 of running and optimizing a data center. I expect to see a whole lot more investigation into how can we leverage machine learning, how can we use software in new and better ways to optimize the data center. Hyperconverged infrastructure is a part of that, certainly. But even going back to converged infrastructure, things don't always grow in linear ways. That's why it's not just hyperconverged infrastructure these days. You see disaggregated infrastructure that is converged. And so I think we're going to see a Gen 2, Gen 3 of a data center that frankly gives better cost management to the operations team.
Yeah. Now, to be clear for those folks listening at home, if you are an SMB or a lower size commercial organization and your data center is one rack in a closet, yes, I encourage you to get rid of the data center and embrace the cloud wherever you can, right? There's no reason for you to run Exchange. There's very little reason for you to run files on-prem. You know, I do think that data center-esque should go away and you should embrace cloud services because frankly, hyperscale cloud infrastructure is going to run it better than you. That's just the reality of many of those architectures. When we talk about enterprise and upper size commercial and certainly governments, right? That brick and mortar raised floor, that ain't going anywhere, right? But your third point, certainly on cloud, that is inevitable for so many organizations. The question at this point, really for most, is how fast are you going to go to cloud? And to your concern point you mentioned earlier about COVID, for many folks, the reaction to COVID was get to the cloud faster, right? Can we talk about that? The new landscape for IT and the fact that for most folks, we are disproportionately more cloudy in October 2020 than we thought we would be when this year kicked off.
Yeah, it's interesting. If you compare this year to last year, and I know I'm not supposed to be talking quite about Veeam yet, but if you look at things like backups, last year people were sending their backups into the cloud, but I actually was looking at this morning. Maybe I shouldn't be sharing this number, but I will. In the first 3 quarters of this year, we've actually moved over 120 petabytes to the public cloud. And you might ask, well, why is that the case? We don't charge for this, by the way. It's part of the product, as you know. Why is that? Because people aren't going into their data centers anymore. They're not actually moving tapes from one system to another system. And so leveraging the cloud as part of the strategy, I think, came to the forefront in this year because people weren't going into the raised floor data center. They weren't doing things the way they have been over the last several years. And so the adoption of cloud as part of the strategy has increased. However, I look at it more like being cloud ready rather than cloud first. Everyone said, we're going to go to the cloud, we're going to go to the cloud. And as you said, in the SMB, that's probably a smart thing to do. But I think more people are rationalizing what they're doing to how do we be cloud ready rather than cloud first? How can we take the operations that we do today and use the cloud when it makes sense, but don't use it when it doesn't make sense?
Yeah, so I want to double click in that, but before we do, let's go back to the map. I want to see how much of the world have we turned green. All right, so as I mentioned, India almost always gets props for joining right on time. Romania's in the house. Mexico, Senegal, Venezuela is becoming a more frequent contributor and participant. So please feel free to chime in that conversation as well. KSA, Brazil, one of my favorite carnivore countries is in the house. Norway, Denmark, Germany, Ukraine, Italy, South Africa. I know I'm a meat eater because I live in Texas and it's kind of a requirement, but it always makes me happy when Brazil and South Africa are there because I know I can always get a good steak in any major hemisphere that way. Poland, Connecticut, Hungary, Paris, and Malaysia. And then, looks like Luxembourg and Nepal might have both just lit up green a little bit. So please, and by the way, tell us, what the last piece of meat that you ate or other last glass of wine would be one that Danny would want to know about as well. All right, but let's kind of double click back into. So we talked about how folks weren't going in the data center. In our pre-call today, right before, we were joking around the fact that I'm wearing a collared shirt, but I'm wearing pajama bottoms, right? And my guess is there's a lot of IT pros that are probably in that same gamut, right? We're not going in the data center anymore. And so any IT modernization initiative that started with go rack and stack new gear, that's not happening. And it probably isn't going to happen for a while. But when we talk about how folks are moving to the cloud, you were a security guy before you were a backup guy, right? For many of your years. Let's talk about, so as we've increased our leverage of cloud, what are the security ramifications for that? And then I've got to double click into that as well.
Sure. Well, the concept of a known perimeter around your organization disappeared a long time ago, and we've recognized that. If you go back 20 years, you would put a firewall around your data center and say you're secure, and then it expanded to the organization. What is certainly the case now is the perimeter expands to all of your cloud assets, to your partners, to edge. So it's all over the place. And certainly I would say that was well in motion before the pandemic. But certainly you have to think about what are the security impacts when you send things to cloud. You have to understand data sovereignty. Where is that data going to live? Who has access to it? So there's a lot of compliance considerations, and it's actually, I would argue, slowed the adoption of cloud in some aspects, especially when there are regulatory pressures and compliance involved with the enterprise organization. However, I always go back to something that I said 15 years ago when I was in the security industry full time. I said, you can take your money and you can put it under your mattress where you can hug it, touch it, and hold it, or you can put it in the bank whose whole business is to secure your money. Which one are you going to do? So those people that don't expect the cloud to be as secure as your own data center, I would question that 9 times out of 10. Why is that? Because their whole business model, their brand is dependent on making sure that they have security, not just bolted on, which many organizations do, but built into the foundations of what they're delivering to their customer.
So I want to push back only slightly on that, slightly because I mostly agree, and the rest because of my boss. But I want to push back just slightly on that, in that. So one of the things that you actually encouraged everyone on our team to do at the beginning of the year during COVID was go learn new skills, right? Take advantage of this time and go learn some new muscle. And I played with some cloud hosting as part of that, but I am a traditional data center IT guy, and I found it somewhat complicated sometimes to open up and then lock down the rest of my access to those new cloud resources I was standing up. And I'm a little guilty of, I kind of just left a couple things wide open just because it was the easiest way for me to get going again. My concern is that skills, not the architecture of the hyperscale cloud, that is a more secure architecture. But my concern is that skills opens the attack surface, not the limitations of the cloud. Is that fair, or maybe overly simplified?
Totally fair. And I would go one step further. I don't think the cloud is the enemy of the security or of availability or whatever you want to talk about. I think complexity is the enemy of security. Complexity is the enemy of availability. Why is it less secure? It's because it's a lot more complex to bring together infrastructure as a service or platform as a service or SaaS, software as a service, and integrate it in with your data center. So in that complexity comes the lack of understanding, a lack of expertise, which leads to, as you point out, security challenges. And this is why I'm very passionate about our partner community, because many organizations don't have that inherent security skill set internally. And so I'm a big proponent of managed security providers. I'm a big proponent of, if I put the Veeam shirt back on for a moment, the Veeam cloud service providers, because they understand the differences between these, and they help in the complexity to smooth it out and to make sure that concepts like availability and security are built in.
Let's talk about availability and security. So this is an area that that our industries have struggled with for a long time, right? I mean, you can roll the clock back. Was it 15 years ago that there was that one juggernaut of a backup company bought a security company, and they thought, oh, this is a marriage made in heaven. And then 10 years later, they got divorced, right? We're not allowed to mention their names online, but maybe people can think about that. But these days, when we talk about data protection, there is that proactive and that reactive that almost always brings security companies and backup companies together. And it is often the partner that has to make that all fit. Is there more that the security technology companies and the backup companies can do together that would help solve for part of this? What do you see if you were the king of the IT world?
Yeah, I don't think about security and backup as ultimately converging in the long term. I do think that they can partner more strongly together. Why do I say that? Typically in most organizations, it's a different silo of the organization. In other words, you end up with different teams, different buyers, different budget between the two. And that complexity leads to challenges within the business and competing priorities of what you need to do. And so I never believed that the company that you're referring to, without naming them, I never believed that they would be successful because different buyer, different budget, different silo, different team. However, is there more that we can do together? Yes. And that's amplified, I would argue, by ransomware. Specifically today, ultimately your last line of defense against ransomware, of course, is bringing back the data, which is a backup concept. And so there are more things like that. And over the past few years here at Veeam, as you know, we have been adding those to our platform. But I do think there needs to be a greater partnership between the infrastructure teams and the security teams. And we're beginning to see this just in general, I would argue, across IT. You think of DevSecOps. It's the whole concept of bringing together three parties, which is the application group that is building it, the operations team that is running it, and the security team. And I think there needs to be more alignment between these multiple partners that are delivering services.
Amen on the alignment part. One of the first things that I talk with IT pros about when we're talking just about IT backup strategy is, when was the last time that you talked to the business owners about what they need versus what is it that you just think you can do? So certainly I think alignment starts in conference rooms and not on racks and infrastructure. So completely on board for that. Danny, I have held you off from getting a chance to talk about Veeam stuff for probably about as long as I can before you're about to bust through that screen. So this is a really exciting time for Veeam, and you are absolutely in the center of all of it. It's one of the reasons we're excited to get you on the program today. Talk to us about what you're excited about right now.
Well, without question, last week, as you know, we announced the acquisition of Kasten. So I could not be more ecstatic, more thrilled about that. I've been pushing for this internally for a while. And so I was excited to see it not past the goal line, because this is the first step in a journey, but to make it public what our initiatives are with Kasten, with containers. Now, why am I excited by that? I write code. I've always written code. And one of the interesting things that I learned personally over the last little bit was around containers and Kubernetes. I tested it out. I installed it, started playing with it. Got very excited about the potential opportunity in front of us. I look at Kasten in the container space as being very similar to where Veeam was in 2008. What do I mean by that? If you go back to 2005, VMware was just taking off. They just launched VMware Server 1.0 in 2005. And everyone said, okay, there's a new technology, we need to protect it. And they would take the traditional ways, which was install an agent in the operating system, or they would take a storage snapshot. And Veeam, of course, looked at the market very differently and said, that's not the right way. We need to take advantage of the modern infrastructure and use modern techniques to protect them. And we built $1 billion business over the last decade on that. Snapshots at the hypervisors and then integrating the snapshots with the storage systems, of course. But when the customer modernized the infrastructure, we recognized that they needed to modernize their backup as well. So how do I liken this? Why am I so excited about Kubernetes and specifically the Kasten acquisition? We're going through the same thing right now. Kubernetes is taking off. It's at the same point that virtualization was back in that 2005 to 2008 range. Over 50% of organizations, there was a recent study by ESG, 52% of organizations were actually using Kubernetes, and that was across all market segments. So they're modernizing the infrastructure, the applications that they're building. And I think there's no better time to modernize the backup approach. And Kasten was doing that. They took an application-centric approach. They could read all of the different storage platforms that Kubernetes can talk to. So they talk about something polyglot persistence, but that's a fancy way of saying they could read structured data, unstructured data, message queues, object storage, clearly S3 and Azure Blob. But they took a very application-centric approach and designed it for Kubernetes. And so why am I excited about this? We built $1 billion business as the market switched to virtualization. I think the next $1 billion is going to come as the market pivots towards Kubernetes and container-based infrastructure.
So I love that perspective, and I think if you're watching the LinkedIn live stream, we also just plugged an article that that I wrote about a week ago, commenting on the Kasten and Veeam parallels along the way. To the producer, if you could bring up the solution diagram alongside with us. One of the things that I think is interesting to note is that in both Kasten's case and Veeam's case, the center of gravity was the platform, right? So whether it's Kubernetes as an architecture or virtualization as an architecture, there's everything storage that you don't want to think about below, and then there's everything application that has to rely on that from above. And truly, for the last year and a half, we've been consistently hearing when folks talk about Kasten, they say, "Oh, you're the Veeam for containers." And what an exciting place that is. That article actually walks through the last 4 generations of when the platform shifted from AS400 to NetWare to Windows Server to virtualization. This is actually the 5th time around that we've gotten to watch as the platform changes. How does data protection have to be reimagined along the way? So now, Danny, is Kasten the only thing that you're excited about these days, or is there anything else going on at Veeam that doesn't start with a K?
We have an awful lot going on at Veeam, clearly. I'm most excited by the team. We have a solid team across Veeam with experience beyond the industry, I would argue, whether it be clearly in product strategy, our R&D teams, the community engagement that they've had, they've led the industry, frankly, in direct-to-consumer engagement with the forums, with the sales teams and in talking to customers. And that has been reflected clearly in this year. We had a fantastic year. We haven't shared our Q3 results, but I'll give a tip of the hat. They're very good. They are very good results. So, the performance, the execution has been very good. However, we always have lots of exciting things up the sleeve. And we have Veeam Live coming up. If you haven't registered for that, I would point you to register for Veeam Live. But, we announced some of the capabilities coming in V11. We announced the top 3 things earlier this year. There are a dozen things in version 11 of the platform that are exciting. We have an announcement coming at Veeam Live next week that you're also going to hear about some additional exciting things. So while I don't want to spill it all in the show, what I'll say is there has been a lot of activity, whether it be on the cloud side, on the Kubernetes side, on our core platform side, on the Office 365 side with adding team support. All of this is exciting to me because ultimately what it gives our customers is a better data protection, data management platform for them to protect their assets.
Yeah, now you mentioned customers. So one of the things that I'm really excited about for the Veeam Live event coming up is I think almost every single session is not just another Veeamer talking about another cool set of technologies that we're doing, but every one of those sessions is talking about how Veeam customers, or in some cases partners, are leveraging those technologies for some really, really cool outcomes. So if you haven't yet plugged Veeam Live, we will actually conclude the episode by giving you some information on that. And also you can click on the QR code in the lower right-hand corner to do that as well. But we actually did do a last-minute ad to the Veeam Live schedule last week. This was kind of supposed to be a surprise, but I guess it got up on the web. But you said there's a dozen features. I'm not sure it's exactly a dozen. There are 11 undocumented things in V11 that we've not talked about yet. I think that is our last episode on the Veeam Live show. So if you have been looking for that one last reason to register, you now have 11 more reasons to register for Veeam Live. So please hit that QR code along the way. Let's bring up the map one last time before we get that last piece of information. So far, so Canada's in the house, Atlanta, and Georgia, or is that Atlanta, Georgia? I'm not sure. Lebanon, Istanbul, Turkey's in the house, Sri Lanka's in the house. So we've gotten quite a bit of green. We've got to get that APJ. We're missing some over there. So that'll be our goal for next week. All right. So before I ask you for kind of that last word, Danny, we do also want to make a plug for Friday. So part 3 of 3 in our series on AWS and on data mobility. David Hill and Sam Nichols have been taking us through a set, and you won't want to miss the punchline. You want to find out, how the story ends. So make sure to tune in for Friday for that. But Danny, I'll give you the last word. For every IT leader that's listening today, if you could just have that one-on-one with them and just say, here's the one thing you really need to know or understand or believe, right? What is that last piece of wisdom you want to leave us with?
I would give leaders 2 pieces of advice. One is to stay curious. If we're not curious, then we're stagnating in what we're doing. And so I go back to, how can I learn more about the cloud? How can I learn more about Kubernetes? How can I be receptive to new ideas? Because there's always opportunities to improve our infrastructures and our service delivery. So tip 1 is to stay curious. And tip 2 is to stay positive. This has been a tough year, 2020. And we have another few months to go, but stay positive, because I do believe that we will build back better from this, that we'll emerge. If we stay curious and learning and listening to people, we'll come back with services and digital answers that are better than they've ever been in the past. And I'm always excited by the future. And I think we have the greatest opportunity in front of us that we've had in the last 2 decades. So it's an exciting time to be in technology.
When has it never been an exciting time to be in technology? All right, but the vacation is on the 6th. This has been a while bringing you here, but thank you so much for joining. For the folks in the 25 countries and the 18 states that all chimed in for today, thank you for joining us. We got a couple questions we're not going to get to on the live stream, but we will answer them in the chat. And hopefully we'll see as many of you as possible at Veeam Live coming up in just over a week. So thank you for joining. Have a great week. Bye-bye.
Thanks.